Now that the leg is done, we're going to move back up to the arm and finish off the hand. So to do that, I'm going to go into the side perspective and start placing my joints from here. And this is kind of a similar process to the way we did the arm, in that we're not going to be placing every single joint along this chain. First, I'm going to place the first knuckle joint, and I'm going to follow right through to the tip of the finger and hit enter. And I do that because we'll be placing joints in between these two joints because we want them all to have the same orientation as one another to make it easier to animate later on. Now from the 3D viewport, we can move that joint chain from the center into the hand and position it from there. So we want to place that knuckle kind of where we'd imagine that knuckle being in the character's hand. So around there looks pretty good. Now back in the side view, we want to insert the rest of the joints in between these two joints here. So I'm going to go to Skeleton and Insert Joint tool. Then from this top knuckle, I'm going to click and drag out to the second knuckle. And then from there, I'm going to click again and place the final knuckle there and hit enter to complete the tool. Something that's important to note is by inserting the joints that way in between two different joints, we get a nice alignment of all our joints. So you'll see that these crosses that represent our joints here in the circles, they're all pointing in the same direction, and this red vector here lines up on all these joints. The only joint that doesn't follow suit is this last joint here, and that's because it doesn't know which way to point. All these other joints had children to point at, but this one here doesn't know which way it wants to face. It was important to have there so that the previous joint knew which way to look, but now that that's completed and everything is in alignment, we no longer need this joint. And if you look after deleting it, we still have our 3 finger joints, and that's all we need to create the correct movement for a finger. Now back in the perspective view, we can take a look at our joints and find them all sticking straight down. So what we want to do is rotate these so that they fit inside this mesh. This process is very similar to how we set up the joints for the arm, in that we just want to be rotating this top joint here any which way to get the alignment correct, but we only want to rotate the joints after that on this one axis, on this y-axis here. That way when we animate them all rotating using one axis, they don't go off in funny directions. They all stay in alignment. So I'm going to continue to fine-tune these by scaling to place these joints lower or higher if they need to, and by rotating so that they fall inside the knuckles that they belong to. Once that's looking okay, we can actually take this top joint and parent it to our wrist up here, so that it becomes part of the one skeleton here. So I shift selected the wrist after selecting the top joint, and I'm going to press P. And now our joint system for the pinky has become part of the rest of our skeleton. Thankfully, we don't have to do that process more than just this once, because what we can do from here is select that top joint and duplicate it by pressing Shift and D. Now when we move that joint away from the pinky, we'll see that it's still parented underneath the wrist, so we no longer have to do that either. So from here, we can just duplicate and move these around to accommodate for the rest of the fingers. So for this ring finger here, it's a little longer, so I want to make sure I'm extending these joints so the knuckles line up with each other and positioning them so that they fit where I feel like they would be in a normal skeleton. So each one of these phalange here are a little bit longer in this finger, so I'm going to be rotating and extending to accommodate for that. And I want to look at the top joint here and make sure that the entire chain is facing the right way, because it might look right if it were placed like this, like each joint is still where it belongs, but actually when you go to rotate it from the y-axis, it veers off in the wrong direction. So make sure that that y-axis is lining up and points straight down that finger so that all the joints follow suit and rotate properly. Now I think that looks pretty good. We can always adjust them little by little later on, but for now I'm going to move on and duplicate this with Shift D and scoot it right over to the middle finger here. And I want to reorient this whole entire chain so that it lines up with that finger. And then I want to move the knuckle up a little bit where I think it belongs there. And then I'm going to extend or retract these bones here so that the following joints line up with their knuckles. And if you're finding it hard to locate the knuckles on your mesh, it does help to use a wireframe view mode, because a lot of times the artist will have created geometry that they intend to be those bending points. So if you see here, there's an extra edge loop, so when the knuckle bends inward, there's more geometry ready to compensate for that bend, and we don't get any funny sharp knuckles or anything like that. So essentially what you'd want is a knuckle under each one of those double edge loop spots, because that's where the bending should take place on the mesh, so it deforms properly. That's good for the middle finger. I'm going to duplicate again here and move it over to the index finger. And now the index is a little smaller, so the knuckle goes up, and we want to shrink this joint here to bring up the rest of the knuckles. And then we want to rotate that chain so it all lines up again, making sure that y-axis lines up with the way the finger should be bending, so it's straight up and down. And again, we're going to rotate and scale these joints into their proper locations. And I'll do the same for this last part here. Scale that up a little bit. And it is a lot of tweaking to get these into the right position. The way this model is actually posed is more organic, so the process of placing these joints is a little less straightforward, and we have to maneuver these joints where they look natural. And once you're happy with that, we can move right on to the thumb here. So I'm just going to duplicate again from the index, and I'm going to position that first knuckle kind of back up here where that belongs. It's going to be up inside the hand a little bit more than we're used to with the other fingers. But the thumb has all the same joints, so we can use the same exact chain just the way it is. So I'm going to push this into the hand a little bit more. Rotate it so that first joint there lines up. I think it should be somewhere around there. And then I'm going to rotate this last joint here, right into that spot where it belongs. And then if I look at the thumb this way, I can see clearly this needs to move out this way so it's centered, and perhaps even be rotated a bit on that x-axis. And I actually think that this could go in more. If you look at your own hand and you move your thumb around, that first joint that rotates, that first bone in there, it's actually tucked up just below the wrist, and then it sprouts out from there. There's just a bunch of chubby flesh there that hides that bone. So a lot of times it can be misconstrued. But what's nice about hand joints, if you ever get confused, you can always look at your own hand. If you're working on the computer, you always have your own hand to look at, for the most part. And if not, you can grab a friend's hand and check out their hand. Now with this thumb finished, I'd say we're done with this hand as far as the joint placement's concerned, and we're ready to move on.